Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
The president says the Strait is open and demined, but few dare to make a run through it. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. As the president adds, there are no talks happening or scheduled for that matter. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Thank you for joining us here. Kailey, what is happening is Israel targeting Hezbollah in Lebanon and Houthi rebels firing on ships in the Red Sea.
Yeah, Iranian proxies are a factor in this conflict in the Middle East. It is not just about the Islamic Republic itself, though it is unclear whether Iran directly is engaged with negotiations with the United States or mediators at this point, because Jared Kushner, the president's special envoy for peace, who was in the region yesterday, said that talks were happening, only for President Trump to, of course, refute that on True Social this morning.
It's getting pretty confusing, I have to admit, knowing that there are also reports of back channels and communications that involve the likes of Tulsi Gabbard, which jumped off the page this morning. But the fact of the matter is there's no breakthrough, certainly when it comes to the standoff in the Strait, and the markets are watching.
Certainly they are, and we're going to get some analysis from someone who used to be inside the rooms at the White House where decisions around national security were made. The former national security advisor to President Biden, Jake Sullivan, is going to be with us shortly. Fascinating to hear his point of view and what he sees as the potential options going forward for the United States, and if there are any good ones left for this administration to make.
That's for sure. We meet at a dangerous moment with Jake Sullivan. Really looking forward to this conversation. We'll get an update from Tyler first at the White House.
Indeed. But first, we get an update on these markets because, of course, they are watching each and every headline when it comes to geopolitics and everything else. So for that, we turn to Amy Morris here in Washington. Hey, Amy.
Hey, Kailey, you're absolutely right. Wall Street pulling further from those all-time highs as AI stocks are back to sinking. We check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 down 0.5%, NASDAQ down 1%, the Dow down 0.2%, the Russell 2000 index down about 1%, the 10-year Treasury yield at 4.71%, the 2-year yield at 4.17%. Crude oil higher, but pairing off those earlier gains. WTI now right at $85 a barrel, and Brent crude just over $91 a barrel. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index now more than 5% lower, led by Micron, which has fallen about 7%. And longer maturity bonds are at the epicenter of anxiety about everything from inflation to the debt-laden AI boom. One fear is that persistent geopolitical turmoil will make economies more prone to supply shocks and inflationary pressures. Bondholders are also worried that governments will fail to rein in spending. The 30-year Treasury yield right now is at 5.2%, 5.28 to be more exact. Walt Disney's ABC network is suing the FCC for allegedly waging an illegal retaliatory campaign against the broadcaster, punishing it for editorial decisions disliked by the Trump administration. ABC now seeking a court order barring the FCC from taking further action on its early license renewal applications or trying to alter the network's exercise of its editorial discretion. Disney shares now more than 1% higher. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back to Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Amy Morris watching the markets for us on this first day post-MOU expiration. Yes, the 60-day memorandum of understanding and that ceasefire period in which there was supposed to be a negotiation over the long-term deal to bring peace between the United States and Iran, or some form of it, is over, and yet no new talks are on the books, and perhaps they will not be if you listen to the words of the president or read them on True Social today, as he says there are no talks or conversations going on or scheduled with the Islamic Republic of Iran. The naval blockade, he says, remains in full force and effect. The Strait of Hormuz is open and operating. All water mines have been removed or detonated. This is in keeping with the repeated suggestion he has made that the U.S. does indeed control the Strait via this blockade, as we heard from him once again yesterday in the Oval Office.
They want to make a deal, but they're not going to make the kind of a deal that I feel is necessary. Look, we're in there for one reason. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. We control it with the blockade. We have a blockade. We control it with the blockade. And I like the idea of declaring it a territory.
The territory of the United States. We'll see if we ever get that far. It's difficult to tell exactly what's happening. As Kailey mentioned, the president saying there are no talks going on after Jared Kushner suggested otherwise, all in the last 24 hours. And ahead of our conversation with Jake Sullivan, we set the baseline with Tyler Kendall, who's live on the North Lawn of the White House, Bloomberg Washington correspondent. Tyler, the president also said that all water mines have been removed or detonated. It was unclear until this moment exactly what the status was when it comes to mines in the Strait. Does that confirm that Iran, in fact, did mine the Strait of Hormuz?
It would appear so, Joe. And we know that this has been actually an ongoing issue in the Iran-Oman talks, keeping in mind that a few months ago when we had first learned the updates that Iran and Oman were trying to figure out some sort of system when it comes to monitoring traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the ideas was to use that so-called middle passage, not the U.S. coordinated route that hugs the coast of Oman, not that route that hugs the coast of Iran, but perhaps the biggest concern at the time was that that middle passage had mines that had been laid. This does appear to be part of President Trump's bid to reassure that the Strait is, quote, open and operating in his words. But we also have to keep in mind the context. Overnight, we got confirmation from the UK Maritime Trade Organization that one vessel was struck by an unknown projectile in the Strait of Hormuz, which prompted at least one casualty, as well as for the Omani Coast Guard to conduct a rescue mission for those remaining crew members aboard that ship. So at this point, as you guys are outlining, very unclear exactly the status when it comes to the Strait. But I will point out, and we've spoken about it before on this program, but it is something to watch. The so-called shuttling route, those shuttling vessels that turn off their transponders, they go through the Strait, and then once they make it through undetected, they transfer their cargo to ships that are waiting just outside the waterway. But Joe and Kailey, I bring that up because data analyzed by Bloomberg shows that the UAE's state-owned oil company has been the most successful at this. But people familiar with the matter now tell Bloomberg that Saudi Arabia is also going to start conducting these shuttle operations, but they are expected to be more limited in scope. And of course, interestingly enough, are going to apply for Chinese refiners.
Well, that's something to watch, especially as we consider potential economic screws that could be tightened against Iran and purchasers of Iranian crude. Tyler, the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, last week talked about announcements that would be coming this week in terms of cutting off Iran from the global economy. Do we have any sense as to whether that's still the plan, when those announcements might be coming?
At this point, Kailey, we don't have that update from the Trump administration. The idea that they are going to opt to tighten the economic pressure over, say, restarting widespread military operations. Now, President Trump himself outlined that there are not discussions, he says, currently with Iran, despite yesterday saying that there had been discussions behind the scenes with top levels of the IRGC. And I'll also give you another headline from today, Qatar's foreign ministry saying that they are currently focusing on getting the U.S. and Iran back to the negotiating table. At this point, there are questions about exactly what the Trump administration can do to continue that economic pressure, considering there have been so many waves of sanctions that Iran has already weathered. But Joe and Kailey, our analysts at Bloomberg Economics, have laid out a few different options, including targeting Chinese refiners of Iranian crude, as I mentioned, going after the so-called shadow fleet, and maybe following through with threats to impose so-called secondary tariffs on any countries that do business with Iran. President Trump had previously floated that could come in at a 25% rate.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on the North Lawn outside the White House. Thank you very much. And we turn from outside the White House to someone who is familiar with the inner workings and has advised a president on national security issues. The former national security advisor to President Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, is joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We appreciate your time, sir, and welcome to Balance of Power on this day that I believe brings us to 172 days since the war with Iran began. We now have experts telling us here, press openly describing this as a quagmire. If you were still advising the president as to options to end this quagmire, which ones are realistically left?
Well, the best option is obviously not realistically available, which would be to go back in time and not start this war in the first place, because President Trump really has put the United States in a strategic cul-de-sac with no clear way out. And really, when it comes down to it, if you stare at it squarely, there are two bad options. One is to keep this war going with all of the costs to the global economy and all of the risks of escalation and further casualties. And the other is to cut a very, very bad deal. And really, Iran is just simply upping the price for that deal with each week that goes by, adding new demands to what it would require to open the Strait of Hormuz. And I think this is the horns of the dilemma that President Trump is locked on, is that to get Iran to actually step away from keeping the Strait closed, which it largely is right now, despite what he says, the United States will have to pay a very steep price, I think, in terms of frozen assets, in terms of sanctions relief, and potentially in terms of something the president previously agreed to, a very large fund for the reconstruction of Iran. And at some point, the president, I think, is going to end up having to bite the bullet and do a bad deal.
Jake, it's great to have you with us on Bloomberg. I'm sure that you gamed out a lot of scenarios involving Iran in your time at the White House. Did the United States, did this administration underestimate this enemy?
There's no doubt about it. The notion that you would conduct a regime change war, you would kill the top leader in Iran, and Iran wouldn't react by throwing everything it had back at the United States, would have been debunked immediately by any serious person in the intelligence community. So the president should have known, and I think did know from his intelligence community, that Iran would look at closing the Strait of Hormuz, would look at hitting U.S. infrastructure across the Middle East, would look at attacking neighbors in the Persian Gulf. And Iran has done all of those things. And the minute the president decided that he was going to launch a war, the end goal of which was the removal of Iran's regime, which is existential for those leaders, they were going to respond in an existential way. And so I think it was not just predictable we would end up where we are, but it was predicted by a lot of people going back to the beginning of this conflict.
Well, of course, the president says it wasn't just about decapitation at the top of Iran's leadership. He says repeatedly, and still does to this day, that the goal is to have a denuclearized, non-nuclear Iran. And when you couple that with the president's statement on True Social today that no talks with Iran are ongoing or scheduled, can you reach that endgame on the nuclear program without negotiations on it?
There's no way. At the end of the day, the only path to verifiably blocking Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon is a deal that includes intrusive inspections in Iran. That is something Iran would have to agree to. That requires diplomacy. It requires negotiations. I do find it interesting that you had Jared Kushner out saying there are talks ongoing, and then you have the president 24 hours later saying there are no talks ongoing. These two things can be squared by the definition of what talks are. Informal contacts outside of the administration, ways of passing messages back and forth. Maybe that's what's unfolding, and that's what Jared Kushner is referring to. But at the end of the day, there is simply no substitute for the United States sitting down with Iran, whether it's with mediators or just simply directly, as we did back in the Obama administration, and coming out with the terms of a deal that does, in fact, put a lid on Iran's nuclear program for the long term. But we've gotten so far off course of that because right now the main point of friction is not actually the nuclear program, whatever President Trump says. It's getting the Strait open. And that's trying to restore a status quo ante that existed before this war kicked off in February, before we even get to questions about a long-term deal on the nuclear file.
Well, as someone who has been negotiating with leaders in the Middle East for years, I wonder your thought on exactly how talks are being conducted, including people who don't even work for the administration or the government. Axios today invoking the name Tulsi Gabbard, speaking with an Iraqi Kurdish leader with close ties to the IRGC. The administration wanted to reach out directly to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Through this intermediary, the U.S. was delivering messages to an IRGC commander. You've got Jared Kushner at the table, who does not have a clearly defined role. Is this the beginning of our problem right now, or is this somehow part of a strategy?
I think there are two things going on here. One, I would lay at the feet of Iran, which is that it has multiple competing power centers and a lot of people jockeying for a voice in their decision-making process. And that does make it difficult to know exactly who the right counterpart is. So I understand the administration's desire to try to get in through multiple channels. But the second thing that's going on here is you have an administration that has basically eviscerated official forms of diplomacy. You have a Secretary of State who isn't really participating in any of the major files, whether it's Ukraine or Gaza or Iran, and you've left a lot to these informal mediators. Sometimes that can work, but I think more frequently it creates the kind of circumstance we have right now where we just simply haven't been able to get traction on a negotiation in several weeks, and it's left the United States in a very difficult position. It's also meant that regional countries are feeling they need to step up to try to broker something themselves because, of course, their interests are deeply implicated in this. And what I would expect will happen as we go on is that these regional countries will try to cut their own deals with Iran to make their lives a little easier, even if over time that comes at the expense of the United States.
Well, it raises the question of Oman, which President Trump suggested yesterday the U.S. would be willing to bomb if it got in the United States' way. Do you see Oman's interest at this point, especially when it pertains to the Strait of Hormuz, as being misaligned with the United States' own?
Look, I think Oman and the United States both want to see the Strait open, and Oman has a deep and rich history of working as a really honest broker in trying to help bring about agreements between the U.S. and Iran. When I worked on the secret talks that first laid the groundwork for the Iran nuclear deal in the Obama administration, where did those talks take place? In Oman. Oman played a critical role in delivering the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. They've played an important role with the backing of the United States over the last few months, trying to work out some modus vivendi to reopen the Strait. So for President Trump to turn around and suggest he is going to militarily attack a country that fundamentally is just trying to bring about a de-escalation of the situation, I think this is kind of par for the course in how the president operates, but it is not a constructive way to work with a partner that, yeah, it's not perfectly aligned with the U.S. because it has its own national interest, but fundamentally wants to see an outcome that is similar to the outcome we want to see, which is the Strait open and traffic flowing once again. And even more importantly, an end to the war, an end to the risk that this spills over in a more dramatic fashion going forward with more suffering and death.
When we were preparing for our conversation, Jake, we saw some reports in the wake of October 7th that President Biden rejected calls from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to launch strikes against Iran. Is that the case? Did Benjamin Netanyahu try to start this war under the previous administration?
Well, without getting into sensitive conversations between two leaders, what I have said and can continue to say is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has tried to get multiple American presidents, including President Joe Biden, to go to war with Iran directly, to have the United States directly engaged in a war with Iran. President Biden didn't do it. President Obama didn't do it. First, President Trump in his first term wouldn't do it. President Trump this time around did say, yes, I will go ahead and start that war, and we're all seeing the consequences of that.
Well, so when we consider Netanyahu, then especially the ongoing questions of Lebanon and Israel's fight against Hezbollah, of Gaza, and the disarmament of Hamas, how much, when it comes to the future trajectory of the Middle East, is going to depend on the outcome of Israel's elections in October? Is Netanyahu actually one of the larger impediments to peace?
Look, there's no doubt that he has continued to stoke conflict and turbulence and wanted this war with Iran to continue, has continued to prosecute the campaign in Lebanon, is continuing to resist the pathway to a full settlement that is being pursued with respect to Gaza. The question, though, of whether a different Israeli government would take a fundamentally different approach to the region, whether to the Palestinian people or to Lebanon or to Iran, I think is still very much an open question. It would depend on the character of that government. One thing I think that would change is that if you had a government that did not have these really radical far-right extremists like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, you could at least push out of power some of the most extreme elements in Israeli politics today.
You know, the standoff in the Strait is resonating in the Korean Peninsula. Jake Sullivan, I'm sure you saw the president's announcement yesterday, based on A, his relationship with Kim Jong-Un, but B, South Korea's decision to not assist the United States in reopening the Strait, to justify his decision to crank down United States involvement in military exercises off South Korea with the South Korean military. We know how important this relationship is in the Indo-Pacific, and most recently here on Bloomberg, I think a lot of our viewers and listeners know how important South Korea is as a player in the memory chip space. Is President Trump making us more or less safe with this move?
Look, at the end of the day, the strength and health of our alliances going forward is going to be measured as much by economics and technology as it is by military deterrence. And as you just noted, South Korea is a vital partner to us. in the semiconductor manufacturing supply chain, in high bandwidth memory, in the memory chip space, as you said, but in many other areas where South Korea makes massive investments in the United States in batteries and electric vehicles, helping to reindustrialize our country. We're in talks with them right now about building out a massive shipbuilding investment in which the United States could once again restore its capacity to build ships that we lost over several decades going back to the 1980s. So to turn around and hit South Korea this way about something so core and existential to their security and ours, basic exercises to make sure that we deter war on the Korean Peninsula, I think this is biting off our nose to spite our face. And President Trump is going to learn over time that continuing to treat allies in this way will come at a cost to the United States in the larger relationship. And I worry that it will come at a cost on these issues of economics and technology at a moment when we are competing vigorously with China and where our work with South Korea is so vital.
Well, so if the danger here potentially, Jake, is that other countries get drawn closer to China, and China obviously is watching all of this unfold from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Is it Xi Jinping that comes to Washington next month, where he's intending to meet with President Trump at the White House on a stronger footing than the United States?
Look, if you're sitting in Beijing right now and you're advising Xi Jinping, and you're looking at a net assessment of America's capabilities and China's capabilities, you're saying to yourself, what does America have that we don't? Well, one of the biggest things America has historically brought to the table in the competition with China is a network of powerful, robust alliances in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. And China has had a long-term strategy of wanting to undermine those alliances, to weaken them, to divide the United States from its allies. And they're looking right now and saying, wait, President Trump is actually doing our work for us. And I think it does mean that President Xi will come with a certain swagger in his step, because he believes that they are making progress economically and technologically, they are making inroads diplomatically, and the United States is losing or is degrading one of the most critical assets that it has. I think the other thing that President Xi has done over the course of the last year is shown that China has leverage. When President Trump slapped massive tariffs on China, they responded with the rare earth export controls. And President Trump felt he had to back down and essentially made a huge concession in the trade war. So President Xi will have that in mind, too, when he comes to Washington next month.
So much of your time in the Biden White House was spent on the war in Ukraine, Russia's war with Ukraine, that actually ties into this larger conversation that we're having. Jake, we can't ask you about this. We can't not ask you about this before you leave. Because of the munitions that we have been spending on this war with Iran, we have left Ukraine now at this point with no Patriot missile interceptors, we understand, and the idea of providing a license for Ukraine to make its own seems to have been withdrawn by this administration. Have we abandoned Ukraine?
Thankfully, we are still doing some of the critical things that are necessary to support Ukraine in its fight for freedom, independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, namely continuing to provide intelligence. But in the opening days of the war, some of America's foremost bipartisan national security experts came out and said that starting this war with Iran is going to help Putin because it's going to mean we divert Patriot missiles away from Ukraine. And Putin sees that. And so what's he doing? He's launching larger and larger salvos of missiles at Ukraine, knowing that Ukraine doesn't have the interceptors to be able to defend itself. And his goal this winter will be to plunge Ukraine into cold and darkness by taking out its electricity grid, taking heating offline, taking lighting offline. And we are leaving Ukraine naked to those kinds of attacks. And this, too, was very much both predicted and identified at the beginning of the war as a huge cost. And I do believe that we have unnecessarily expended these massive numbers of Patriot interceptors to fight a war that made no sense from the start. And you can see the immediate direct knock-on effects for the people of Ukraine, who nonetheless are fighting incredibly bravely and effectively in stymieing Russia on the front line, and frankly in taking the fight directly to Russia as well.
Well, I'll tell you, there were many days during the Biden administration where we wished we could have had this kind of time with you, Jake Sullivan. We appreciate your joining our conversation today on Bloomberg, and we hope that it will not be the last. Jake Sullivan with us live on Balance of Power. Thank you for the time. We're going to play everything we just talked about to the panel coming up next. And we've got a good one today in John McCarthy and Jeff Burton. First, we want to take a look at Wall Street. It's been a minute since we've checked on the markets, and Bloomberg's Amy Morris has that covered for us. Amy, what do you have?
Thanks so much, Joe. Anthropic's revolving credit facility is set to rise above its roughly $10 billion target. It's getting ready for a highly anticipated IPO, and sources tell Bloomberg those talks are ongoing. A $10 billion plus revolving credit line would be a substantial increase over a $2.5 billion 5-year facility that Anthropic secured last year. A sell-off in chip makers sent stocks lower, the market also falling as inflation anxiety and rising government debt kept bond yields elevated. We check those markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 down 0.5%, NASDAQ down more than 1%, the Dow is down 0.1%, the Russell 2000 index also down more than 1%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.7%, the 2-year yield at 4.17%, and the 30-year yield at 5.28%. Crude oil is higher. WTI right at $85 a barrel. Brent crude just over $91 a barrel. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index 5.5% lower, led by Micron, which is more than 7% lower. Goldman Sachs will pay as much as $410 million to buy LCN Capital Partners, a commercial real estate investor. The deal targets a booming corner of the real estate market that's attracted asset managers looking for a synthesis of real estate and corporate credit. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back to Balance of Power now with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. Watching the markets for us, and energy markets specifically, which are keeping a close eye on what's happening in the Middle East as we think about potential endgames, if there is one to be found, between the United States and Iran. We, of course, just spoke with the former National Security Advisor to President Joe Biden, Jake Sullivan, who suggested that he sees the U.S. as eventually going to need to accept a bad deal when it comes to Iran. And it's interesting to view Jake Sullivan's comments in the context of the polling we have just gotten out from Reuters and Ipsos in a poll that was taken August 14th through 17th. So this week, it found 80% of those surveys believe that the U.S. involvement in Iran will go on for an extended period of time. That breaks down 87% of Democrats believe that, and so too do 71% of Republicans, Joe. And in this poll overall, the president's approval rating, which is tied, of course, to the conflict and also feelings about the economy, dipped to a all-time low of just 33%.
Stark. We turn to the politics of war with our political panel. John McCarthy, Democratic strategist, principal at Causeway Strategy Group, and Jeff Burton is with us, the Republican strategist, co-founding partner at Maven Advocacy. John and Jeff, thank you so much. Jeff, I'll start with you. On the word quagmire that keeps coming up here, the Washington Post fronted its coverage with that word in the headline today. Jake Sullivan was talking about it, using that term as a point of fact. Is that what this is?
I don't think it is. I think we have to be a quagmire is a lot longer than what we've been dealing with, which is just over 6 months. I think part of it is at the onset, the Trump administration could have done a better job, for sure, messaging why we were going to war in Iran, why the conflict was happening, and that it may be more than two weeks to a month. And I think expectations game really is hurting the messaging and hurting the Republicans here. But I would absolutely not call it a quagmire. We've been, Iran has been a state sponsor of terrorism for more than 40 years, and every president has just played around. And you look at what they're doing now with giving drones to Russia against Ukraine, what they've done in Yemen, Oman, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda. There's a long history of Iran opposing the U.S. and being an active partner in terrorism, and that's going to take a little bit longer to get rid of and make sure that we're safe.
Well, your point, Jeff, is well taken that this has only been about a 6-month conflict. But, John, I guess I wonder if a quagmire is so much about looking backward about the amount of time that has passed already, or looking forward to no real end date in sight. The suggestion that this could go on for an indefinite period of time. Is that not what the 80% of Americans were suggesting in that Reuters Ipsos poll?
Well, I think that quagmire could kind of be applied to the entire problem that we have right now with the Trump presidency. First off, great interview. And one of the things that I really took away from it was almost just the sense of temperament that came from Jake. I worked with Jake, think he's a brilliant mind. But one of the things, just the calmness and steadiness of that interview, I think is such a contrast to what we see now. And I think one of the undercurrents about all the polls that you just shared, both in terms of support for the conflict and the president's approval rating overall, is that there's an overstimulation from the presidency. Most Americans don't want to sit and think about the president every single moment of the day. Donald Trump was elected to lower costs. He was elected to say that he would, never start a new forever war. And he's basically not focused on the first and dove right into the second. So that's not going to go over well with voters as we look towards the midterms. But I do think that the undercurrent going underneath all of this is that whether it's the conflict here, whether it's the conflict with the economy, the on and off again tariffs, this overstimulation and chaos benefits no one in his political party and is why his numbers are so low.
Well, now that we're in months beyond weeks, there is a question about Congress's role in all of this. Lawmakers are on recess until after Labor Day. Jeff, Senator Tim Kaine saying just yesterday, in the last 24 hours, that he will file yet another war powers resolution when they return, but in this case to block the president from targeting Oman, which he threatened to do yesterday, to bomb Oman if it gets in the way of negotiations or the blockade. He told Fox he would bomb the S out of them. I'm just curious, once we get beyond primary season, and we're just about there with the contests that are taking place today, will there be more emphasis on having a say in war powers and an authorization of the use of military force from Republican lawmakers?
I don't think that it'll really have anything to do with what happens in Congress. I think it'll be related to the messaging. Republicans need a better message on Iran. It's definitely hurting them with the voters right now, and being able to be on message and have more focus, like John said, I think that is somewhat hurting Republicans right now. I'm not real worried. They voted on any war powers resolution that's been voted on almost every week in the Senate over the last 2-3 months, and with very limited movement on that. So I wouldn't expect too much interest of that. It'll be voted on in September, but I don't think it'll really affect voters that much or pick up many Republicans.
Well, so it raises the question, John, of if there is a better way for Democrats to counter and show that they're opposed to the conflict and its ongoing nature. Do war powers votes really even get any oxygen? Does the everyday voter pay attention to that?
Voters aren't blind. And the Republicans in Congress, especially in the House of Representatives, have basically handed the president a blank check since the start of this administration. Congress, the Article 1 branch of the Constitution, a co-equal branch of government, has certainly not behaved as such. There have been a few exceptions kind of in recent 2 months or so, where maybe some senators have stepped forward to try and put the kibosh on some of President Trump's more extreme ideas like slush funds for January 6 participants. But by and large, the American people have looked at their members of Congress and said, you're not advocating for me, you're just cozying up and siding up with the president. The title of the job is representative. People go to Washington in order to serve the people that they're elected by. And I think that, those members of Congress, like in swing districts who are Republicans, that are looking at, gas prices up, grocery prices up, the spike in healthcare premiums, that's very hard to explain to your constituents back home, other than just sitting and saying, Donald Trump wanted me to do it. And that's not going to be something that they're rewarded for come November.
$4.06 is the national average today. Jeff, $4.06 is the national average today. Does that number need to come down for Republicans to maintain majorities?
Absolutely. The economy is judged on the street corner, and that's gas prices. And you saw about a month ago, before the Iran war kicked up again, gas prices were coming down 75 cents to $1, and it simultaneously happened with Republicans and Donald Trump's poll numbers going up. That's going to happen, and if it needs to happen for Republicans to be able to do well and have a chance at keeping the House and their majority in the Senate, for sure. And I just like to mention again on the House and Senate floor, going back to the last point, that John Boehner, former Speaker of the House, was in Congress for almost 30 years. He said it best, that only 2 times in his whole entire terms did the House floor ever really make it into the public mind. It's more about the overall what's happening than one thing, and that's why I don't think the war powers vote really makes much difference, because there's so much information for voters to take in that what happens with one vote is has very limited impact.
Well, when we consider the way in which voters are thinking about this conflict, yes, how it's impacting them economically with prices at the pump is one consideration, but we've also seen it create even more blowback against Israel, John, and the Netanyahu government. We could see that on display in the primaries today in Florida with a few Democrats who are vying to stay in Congress. How complicated is that issue for your party?
You know, it's something that Democrats are going to have to deal with. Some of these things are conversations that I think are best had in the majority. I don't think that writ large, this is something on the mind of every single Democratic voter. People have to run in races that are local to them. So if this is something that's relevant for their community, I think it's a worthwhile conversation to be had amongst their community about who they want to send to the Congress. But at the same time, you have Donald Trump saying things like, Americans are going to pay a teeny bit more so that a very bad country couldn't have a weapon. I think that American people are incredibly patriotic and Americans are willing to shoulder that burden, but it's on the president to be able to explain to them what the off-ramp for all of this is. So the conflict in the Middle East spurring this affordability crisis is going to fundamentally be the issue that this election is about. People want to know what he's going to do to bring down their cost of living. That's what it's going to be about.
All right, John McCarthy and Jeff Burton, our political panel today. Thank you so much. And we'll have more ahead on the primaries in Florida and beyond today when our colleague Bill Ferries joins us. We'll also be joined by the Democratic nominee for governor of Texas, Gina Hinojosa, will be joining us next on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Meta Platforms facing a jury trial in federal court over claims it deliberately designed Facebook and Instagram to encourage compulsive use among young users. The trial carries enormous risk for Meta, with potential penalties of as much as $1.4 trillion, and could have a material impact on the company's business and how its platforms operate. Meta shares now nearly 4% lower. A sell-off in chip makers sent stocks lower, the market also falling as inflation anxiety and rising government debt kept bond yields elevated. As we check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg, the S&P 500 is down 0.5%, NASDAQ down 1.2%, and the Dow is down about 0.2%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.7%, the 2-year yield at 4.17%, and the 30-year yield at 5.28%. Crude oil inching higher now, WTI at $85 a barrel and Brent crude more than $91 a barrel. And the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index about 5.5% lower, led by Micron, which fell more than 7%. New residential construction in the U.S. fell in July as single-family starts slid to its slowest pace since 2022. Housing starts decreased 12.4% last month to an annualized rate of 1.24 million. That's below all estimates. And pending sales of previously owned homes dropped in July to the weakest since the start of the year. An index of contract signings decreased 2.3%, the lowest since January, and matching the second worst reading in data back to 2001. The average 30-year mortgage rate is sitting just below the one-year high it hit in July, locking in a lot of would-be sellers in their homes and making homes unaffordable for a lot of buyers. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back to Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. Amy, we'll be back with more on the markets coming up in just about 20 minutes. Top of the hour, 2 p.m. Eastern as we kick off Bloomberg Business Week Daily live from New York. Happy primary day. It's like Christmas morning around here on Balance of Power. We've got 3 states in play, Alaska, Wyoming, and Florida. So we've got some drama here. Kailey, look no further than the 19th district. This is currently represented by Byron Donalds, who is, by all accounts, on path to become the first black nominee for governor in the state of Florida. He's considered the front runner potentially in the general election as well. But who do we replace him with in the 19th? The headline at Greg Giroux's analysis from Bloomberg Government, Kailey, ex-convicts and cast-offs flock to Florida for wild GOP primary. Some are calling it the clown car. You've got a number of folks who have run for office in other states. If you like electoral drama, this is where you find it.
Yeah, there's no shortage of that in today's primaries, not just in the race for Byron Donalds' seat, but considering Florida is voting with a new House district map in place, there are a lot of other contested races to watch as well as Democrats try to retain seats in Congress in districts that are now much more plus Trump than the ones that they were sitting in earlier. You also have Corey Mills in the 7th district, who doesn't have the backing of President Trump, doesn't have the backing of Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, doesn't even have the backing of many of the members of his congressional delegation from Florida. So let's get into all of these now as we turn to Bill Ferries, Bloomberg News senior editor, who is covering all things midterms for us. So, Bill, I guess pick your poison in Florida, whether it's one of the House races or the gubernatorial race. What could we learn in the ultimate count when the votes come in?
Yeah, we're going to be seeing some interesting dynamics playing out on both the Republican and the Democratic side. You talked about that race for governor, Byron Donalds. He should handily win that contest. He's got a $100 million war chest. He's got a big backing from people like Ken Griffin, but he does have 11 other candidates to run against, including some far to the right of his own candidacy. So the whole tug and push and pull within the Republican Party between what we're calling MAGA and ultra MAGA is going to play out in that race. It just takes a plurality to win, so he doesn't need to get 50%. But a lot of people are going to be looking to see how strong of a candidate he is after tonight's primaries. If he gets over 50%, that'll be a big win. But it's the same thing for Democrats. You've got some progressives and incumbents fighting each other. You've got Debbie Wasserman Schultz down there in the 20th district. That's going to be a race I think people are watching very closely to see if she can, after jumping districts following that redistricting, whether she can pull off a victory in what has been a district that has been run by black lawmakers for decades now. So a lot of great dynamics playing out, and Florida never disappoints.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because as Kailey introduced or reminded us, this is a Republican redrawn congressional map. So it's made life complicated for incumbents like the aforementioned Debbie Wasserman Schultz. How difficult is it going to be to predict the outcomes in some of these races, because you've got incumbents in a strange land?
Yeah, you have incumbents in a strange land. You don't have a lot of great polling. But remember, when Ron DeSantis went ahead and pushed forward with that redistricting, the goal was to give Republicans a 4-seat edge in the state. A lot of Republicans were uncomfortable with that change, and we're not going to know whether that really pays off for the Republicans until November. But a lot of Republicans felt like their solid districts were getting watered down a little bit to try to help Republicans gain an advantage in some of these Democratic districts. So it's not just Democrats scrambling. There are a lot of nervous Republicans wondering what the vote totals are going to look like tonight.
Really interesting. Bill, thank you. It's great to have you. Bloomberg News senior editor, helping us get ready for another primary night. This is going to be one of the last big ones here on the campaign trail, so we'll be paying very close attention. You'll have a lot to distill with these races tomorrow, it looks like. Indeed, we will. We can't forget about Alaska with the Dan Sullivan's plural. Dan Sullivan, did we decide? Dan's Sullivan, yes, exactly right. There's great confusion for some on the ballot up there. They even have the same looking logo. It's a little hard for me to decipher. Yeah, and will it have an impact in the results tonight in determining which Dan goes up against Mary Patola? We'll see. Exactly. We have a great opportunity to spend some time with someone who's in the fight here in Texas. Gina Hinojosa is the Texas state representative who's the Democratic candidate for governor and is actually in Washington today. I'm delighted that you could come see us here on Balance of Power. You know, we have this conversation, Democrats, blue dogs all the time. This is going to be the year that Democrats flip Texas, and then for some reason it doesn't quite work out that way. Give us a sense of the psychology that Democrats have right now in Texas and the opportunity that might lie ahead in November.
Yeah, something special is happening in Texas right now. And I understand we've had our hearts broken before about Texas as Democrats, but what is happening is different this time. I will tell you, James Tallarico and myself were crisscrossing the state, and what we see is this energy for change. It is not that people are suddenly Team Democrat. No. People are just, whatever this is, we don't want it. There is this anti-incumbency fervor in Texas, and Greg Abbott has been in statewide office 30 years, as governor for 12 years. He's the most entrenched incumbent there is, and so it creates this opportunity for my campaign and, frankly, for Democrats in Texas.
Well, so when you talk about this anti-incumbent fervor, do you see a single issue as being the primary driver of that? And if so, what is it?
I will say that right now, data centers are an issue that has gotten a lot of attention, especially in our rural Republican areas, where what has happened is data centers have descended into the rural Republican areas. There's almost been like a gold rush, really, of data centers coming. Greg Abbott gave them very rich tax breaks so they don't pay any tax, for instance, on electricity that they consume. We're losing about $1.5 billion a year. But the reason why rural Texans don't like it is because there are no rules in these areas. They're in what we call the unincorporated areas, right? Their local officials have no way to regulate these data centers. They don't have street lights. They don't have paid firefighters or EMS. And these hyperscale data centers have emerged in their communities, and people just feel helpless. They want a seat at the table to decide if and how these data centers come.
So do you see eye to eye with Greg Abbott on this? Who came first on this one? Or is this truly a bipartisan issue now?
No, so Greg Abbott refuses to call a special session to pass laws to protect Texans against data centers.
So his review of data centers does not impress you as a controlling approach to this?
No, he's reviewing himself is all he is doing.
Okay.
Without laws in place, there are no real protections. We all understand that come November 4th, the day after the election, his letters to himself, his audits of himself, those go away. He's received $20 million from data centers in this campaign cycle.
Okay, so if you don't buy his pause for an audit notion, do you support the idea of a general moratorium, at least for a certain period of time? If so, for how long?
I have called for a moratorium until the legislature can meet to pass laws to protect Texans. And the legislature could meet today. Greg Abbott has the sole authority to end this data center madness. I've called on Greg Abbott to call a special session of the legislature. He's called many before. Remember, he called one for mid-decade redistricting last year. So to call a special session so we can come together and pass laws to protect people.
But what should those laws look like?
Well, there's a lot to do. I will say that we know that there can be good jobs in making these data centers. I talk to people who build them, and it's good pay, so I don't want to dismiss that. But then there are also data centers that are shipping in workers to build these data centers, and that's not about creating jobs. They should be American union jobs, first of all, that are building these. They should not be subsidized. The taxpayers should not have to be paying for this. They're owned by the richest men in the world. They should pay for themselves. We need some regulations on water, on electricity, and finally, that end product of AI that is supposed to replace all of us in the workplace, right? We need some real constraints there, some bright lines about we shouldn't use AI to replace teachers, to replace nurses, to make life or death decisions or decisions about our health.
We're getting ready for the news anchor bots to show up, so let us know when we have to worry about that. But is this the deciding issue in your campaign?
No, but it is the latest example.
It's the one you've seized on.
Well, it is the latest example of Greg Abbott doing the bidding of the moneyed interest, the special interest, and not the people of Texas. And so it is one that people have kind of grabbed onto.
Well, let's talk about some other animating issues that we're seeing nationwide, and I'm curious how you're seeing them play out in Texas. And immigration, for example. We're fresh off of a primary we saw in Minnesota, where, of course, there were the 2 fatal shootings of American citizens by ICE, and the establishment candidate who had backed the Laken Riley Act ultimately lost to a far-left challenger with immigration as the issue. I wonder how you are approaching that issue in Texas, and if you also see the kind of fissures between the far left and moderates to approach that policy specifically.
What I see in Texas is really we're just all on the same page. We want something that makes sense. They just shot and killed a man in Houston, Texas, who was on his way to work. An unmarked car pulled over this man, Salgado Araujo, who was on his way to work, and shot first and asked questions later. They killed him. In an environment like that, nobody is safe. People are mad about these ICE raids that are going after people who've been in our country 20 years, hardworking, law-abiding. We all want border security. Yes, I'm from the border. Of course I want border security. We don't want people crossing into this country who mean us harm. At the same time, we should not be treating people who've been in this country 20 years, who are abiding by the law, who are part of our communities, part of our families. Many of us come from mixed status families. My own mother was born in Mexico. But so border security, yes. What is happening with these ICE raids is making us less secure, not more secure.
So when we delineate between those two the way that you just did, does this administration deserve credit for securing the border?
I will say there are few crossings at our Mexico border because of what Trump has done. Yes, he
Okay.
does.
Has that made Texas safer?
Likely, yes. Likely it has made Texas safer in that sense, but less safe when it comes
Okay.
to these ICE raids
Right.
in our community.
How about the impact on the economy, though? The impact on the job market?
Yeah,
where we're watching many jobs go unfilled because of this.
Absolutely. There is no plan, right? There has been in Texas a lot of undocumented labor. That's just the reality, right? And now that these people have been detained and deported, these immigrants who are just showing up to their jobs have been detained and deported. They're not people to do the jobs, and there is no plan. And that is a real problem. I will also say about the security issue.
Yeah.
We have a district attorney in Harris County who says he has child sex abuse cases he cannot prosecute because the witnesses are too afraid to come forward or have been detained or deported. So that makes us all less safe.
We just have a minute left. I want to get to public schools as we've seen
Yeah.
takeovers in certain areas. Austin could be next. What's wrong with Texas's public schools, and how do you propose to fix it?
We need a back to basics approach. I had a press conference last year with MAGA moms with me for my bill, which is my plan, to let's wipe clean all the grift, all the vendor contracts that are really to Greg Abbott's donors, use that money to pay our teachers to be amongst the highest paid in the nation. We have to put money back into the classroom, not into bureaucracy in Austin, not into these grifting vendor contracts.
Do you need to raise taxes to do that as well?
Absolutely not. We are a high tax state in Texas. We pay very high property taxes under Greg Abbott. There's the money, there aren't the priorities.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much for joining us. She's the Democratic candidate for governor of Texas, Gina Hinojosa, here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. And of course, we'll be back for more Balance of Power later on
said it.
at 5 p.m. Eastern Time.
Right here, alongside Kailey Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. We'll see you at 5 on Bloomberg TV and radio.